the ways in which then you break out of this demonic material realm, this is what Gnosticism's trying to deal with. And Gnosticism is inherently a syncretic tradition. What I mean by that, it's a blending of multiple things. It's the blending of Christianity. It's the blending of Judaism. It's the blending of Zoroastrianism, has Persian influences. There's a blending of Plato and Neoplatonism, especially the theurgic elements of Neoplatonism. Those are going to be familiar with Neoplatonism. There's even Buddhist elements that get brought into Gnosticism. The Gnostic traditions were not talking about sin and repentance as much as they were talking about the illusion and enlightenment. You can almost think of the Hindu concept of Maya. Maya is the Sanskrit term for illusion. The idea that materiality is an illusion. This isn't ultimately real. Therefore, epistemically, in regards to knowledge claims, truth claims, you can't make any truth claims about material because it's all an illusion.
O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but Thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
I want to talk to you guys about the ultimate overview of Gnostic heresies from the ancient period into the Middle Ages. And so today's stream, I'm actually really excited about. I imagine for most people, you're going to learn about, at least become aware of, so many different Gnostic traditions that you'd probably have never heard of. We're going to be going again. I had, I think, over near 40 different Gnostic schools or traditions or orientations that we're going to discuss. And so today's stream, we're not going to be getting super in depth into any of them. The goal is to provide the most comprehensive overview of Gnosticism, basically from the ancient period into the Middle Ages. Why the Middle Ages? Well, after the Renaissance, we start getting into these esoteric, what really was generally described as the Western esoteric traditions, and that is a syncretic blend of alchemy and astrology and magia and Gnosticism. So it really becomes its own thing. When we talk about Gnosticism in groups that, well, we're going to highlight some of the tendencies of the ancient Gnostic school, where when we look at like Gnosticism in the contemporary period, there's a lot of things that are still Gnostic. I'm actually going to go over a handful of general attributes of Gnosticism that we still see, but one of them is the Christology. It's very common in the New Age, which has a lot of Gnostic elements, that they have a sort of Arian Christology, right? The whole Christ consciousness thing, Christ consciousness. Well, that is an Arian Christology, that he's basically a man who becomes enlightened, and again, within a Gnostic worldview, through spiritual knowledge. Whereas the Gnostic sects that we're going to be highlighting today, the vast majority actually have a docetic Christology. What do I mean by that? Well, Docetism, as we'll highlight, is actually a heresy that rejects the humanity of Christ. And so he is God, he is fully divine, but is he man? Did he defecate? Did he have genitalia? Did he bleed? No. Those were just emanations. That was a representation. That was an illusion. And so a lot of these ancient Gnostic schools that we're going to be going over today, they have an epistemic rejection of the material world due to their creation narrative. And so we're going to highlight all this stuff before we start going through. Again, I have tons of things that I want to cover with you guys today. So I really do think there is going to be no overview like this overview today in regards to discussing all these different traditions. And that's the point, is that some of you guys maybe become more interested in certain traditions. For example, some of you know my academic research. I was very much interested in trying to highlight. I was, one of this book, The Psychedelic Gospels, looking at all these sort of Christian frescoes that contain like what appeared to be like Amanita muscaria mushroom references. Back in my psychedelic days, even my Gnostic days when I was very sympathetic to Gnosticism, I was like, oh, wow, there's these ancient Christian traditions that were using psychoactive mushrooms in a sort of Eucharistic endeavor. Well, diving deeper and deeper and deeper, I became aware, well, all these churches are sort of historically contextualized right around the growth of the Cathar heresy. Cathar, some of you guys are going to be familiar with that. We're talking about southern France, southern Germany, northern Italy. But how did they get there? Well, that comes from the influence of the Paulicians out of Armenia, the Tondrakians in Armenia, the Bogomils in Bulgaria, all of which were Gnostic, and all of which were participating in, well, we could say in various forms of potentially intoxicating endeavors for spiritual knowledge. So to begin then today's stream, I got to say, like, what is Gnosticism? Because this is a bit of a misnomer. I got all these books down here on Gnosticism, and this one right here by Michael Allen Williams. This is a scholastic book that it says Rethinking Gnosticism, an argument for dismantling a dubious category. Why? Because is there such thing as a singular Gnosticism? Is there a single tradition we can describe as Gnostic in the ancient world? Actually not. There's a handful of tendencies, and that's what we're going to use to describe Gnosticism. And then we're going to go over, again, all these different schools, tons of different schools, the Simonians, the Borborites, the Carpocratians, the Sethians, the Ophites, the Thomasines, all these different groups are different forms of Gnosticism, which was competing with the Orthodox Church, which was competing with the development of Paul and the apostles in what we would consider Orthodox Christianity, which really gets crystallized in the First Council, or really through the 7 ecumenical councils. But what is Gnosticism then? If it's a dubious category, according to many scholars today, what exactly is Gnosticism then? And so I would say there's a handful of features that can categorize these sort of spiritual worldviews as quote unquote Gnostic or participating in Gnosticism. The first and foremost category is this sort of existential pursuit for spiritual knowledge in relation to self-divinization. And so Gnosticism is absolutely emphatic that the ways that we become divinized, the ways you return to the realm of pure light, because again, Gnosticism is going to reject the material world as de facto ontologically evil because of their creation myth. And this is the vast majority of the Gnostic traditions that we're going to look at today. They almost all have a sort of Marcionism, another heresy, which believes that the Old Testament God is different from the New Testament God, and that the Old Testament God is in fact Yaldabaoth, Beelzebub, the devil, the evil one, the sort of bastardized child that comes from Sophia, the personified feminine wisdom figure. Okay. And so the ways in which then you break out of this demonic material realm, this is what Gnosticism's trying to deal with. And Gnosticism is inherently a syncretic tradition. What I mean by that, it's a blending of multiple things. It's the blending of Christianity. It's the blending of Judaism. It's the blending of Zoroastrianism, has Persian influences. There's a blending of Plato and Neoplatonism, especially the theurgic elements of Neoplatonism. Those are going to be familiar with Neoplatonism. There's also a blend. There's even Buddhist elements that get brought into Gnosticism. And so Gnosticism is, in a way, a sort of attempt to amalgamate and bring together all these different religious traditions to form a new concept of what Christ is, generally speaking. So they use Jesus Christ. And for those of you who have read the Nag Hammadi scriptures, we're going to get into what these things are, because it wasn't really until 1945 that we even could read Gnostic texts written by Gnostics. You see, for the vast majority of history, all we had was Hippolytus, Tertullian, most notably Irenaeus against heresies of what these Gnostic groups were and what they believed in. A lot of their literature got destroyed due to them being heresies. And so in 1945, a couple brothers in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, stumbled across this glass jar filled with manuscripts and codexes. In fact, they burned some of them just to keep warm, not knowing what exactly they had. Eventually, a man saw what they had. He said, guys, these are ancient manuscripts. They get translated and forms what's called the Nag Hammadi scriptures. These are basically 48 other books describing, in a way, some sort of apostolic connection to Jesus, or reframing who Jesus is. Are they apostolic? No. That's the thing, is all these books, I think, one of the earliest ones and probably the most famous Gnostic text is the Gospel of Thomas, and we know for a fact that was in the 2nd century. So that was somewhere between the year 100 and 200. Most scholars settles somewhere, last I checked, somewhere between like 120 to 160 AD. Were these connected to the apostles? Was the Gospel of Thomas connected to the Apostle Thomas who traveled to India? No, it's not. But to get authority during this ancient period, they would write the Gospel of Mary. They would write the Gospel of Judas. They would write the Gospel of Thomas as if they were coming from those apostles and part of that apostolic tradition. And so the things that unify what we're going to call Gnosticism today is the idea that the material world is bad. This was created not by the transcendent Trinity or God. It was created by a bastard child, Yaldabaoth, that comes from Sophia. And therefore, they take an epistemic approach to materiality as de facto wrong, bad, and evil. When we look at the New Age, as I said, this actually kind of gets flipped. And so for the Gnostics, they adopted a very Platonic and Neoplatonic view that things that are non-physical or spiritual are somehow better than those that are physical and material. And we look at the New Age today, their worldview is actually going to sort of ingratiate materiality as good. The cosmos is good. Your body, sex, all this stuff is really good. And therefore you see the Christology flip where it privileges Christ as a man who learns knowledge and becomes divine Christ consciousness versus these ancient Gnostic and medieval heresies that said, no, he's actually only divine, and all that humanity stuff, that's an illusion. That's not real because it's evil, right? So if God is pure light coming from the realm of the pleroma, then when Jesus Christ came to save us from this bastard creation, which is the general premise of their creation narrative, that again, the New and the Old Testament are separate. So the New Testament, Christ coming from the pure light is God, but he's breaking through these various forms of emanations, taking on the illusion of a physical body so that he could then teach us how to break free and return back to the pleroma, the realm of the pure light. So this in a way is a prison. The material world is a prison in the Gnostic sense. Their worldview is also does not talk in terms of sin and repentance. So this is a fundamental paradigmatic difference between what would become Orthodox Christianity, even the Christianity laid out there by Paul in the epistles and some of the other disciples, verse the Gnostic traditions. You see, the Gnostic traditions were not talking about sin and repentance as much as they were talking about the illusion and enlightenment. You can almost think of the Hindu concept of Maya. Maya is the Sanskrit term for illusion. The idea that materiality is an illusion. This isn't ultimately real. Therefore, epistemically, in regards to knowledge claims, truth claims, you can't make any truth claims about material because it's all an illusion. So the Gnostics were consistent with that, so, per se. And therefore, the only way to not be deceived by the illusion is to gain enlightenment through spiritual knowledge, gnosis. Those of you who already know, Gnosticism just comes from the root word gnosis or gnostikos, meaning knowledge, Greek word for knowledge. The whole point is that by acquiring more secret knowledge, you become more divine. And this is another paradigmatic shift. You see, I've talked about this with Father Turbo multiple times, is that Orthodoxy does not believe in secret knowledge. So there's one of the premises that runs through many Gnostic Gospels is that Christ had secret knowledge that he revealed to certain disciples. In the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, it was Mary. In the Gospel of Judas, it was Judas. So in the Gospel of Thomas, it was Thomas. Certain apostles had the secret teachings, the secret goods. Orthodoxy doesn't teach that. Orthodoxy teaches the role of a Christian is to proclaim truth as exoterically as possible. We don't have secret truth, secret tradition, secret gnosis that illuminates us. We're illuminated by the uncreated energies of God, which again gets back into the energy essence distinction. But today's stream's not so much about laying out Orthodox theology as, again, providing this comprehensive overview of Gnosticism. So, like I said, it's an existential pursuit of knowledge, which leads to an apotheotic form of divination. So another difference is that in Orthodoxy, we can think of our worldview as having theosis. In Neoplatonism, we can think of them having henosis. And in Gnosticism, they have apotheosis. Apotheosis is the sort of self-divinization through the acquirement of spiritual knowledge. Theosis is the divinization by grace, God's grace, because Christ, fully God, became fully man, that when we engage in the uncreated energies, we can cross that bridge laid out by Christ into eternity. That is theosis. Henosis, the Neoplatonic worldview, is that through theurgic practices, ritualistic, magical rituals, we can break down the emanations of the world and move back to the one. And so you have theosis, henosis, and then apotheosis. And apotheosis, oh, shout out to Shaunaverse for becoming a member. God bless you, brother. Thank you so much for becoming a member, Shaunaverse. Thank you very, very much, brother. Truly appreciate it. And by the way, all the members, we will be getting more emojis. I know we have a handful of emojis right now. The Ortho Chad, the Ortho Chad Priest, the Beta Atheist. We're going to be getting more thanks to Andrew over at the Crucible and some of his team. They're going to be helping me out. So everybody who's a member, sign up if you can, if you'd like to support. We'll be getting more emojis for all you guys very, very soon. So thank you so much, Shaunaverse, for becoming a member. So theosis, henosis, apotheosis, okay? So you can see the existential element in Gnosticism is about this sort of self-divinizing process, okay? Also, like I said, is there such thing as a singular Gnostic tradition? No, they actually differentiate and disagree on many different topics, and many Gnostic schools were in fact competing against each other. So we have, for example, monism versus dualism. Generally speaking, Gnosticism in many of its forms were dualistic. So this material world was created in eternity and is in opposition eternally to the transcendent light of God. However, there are, in regards to the Gnostic, Syrian, and Egyptian schools, you can see more of a monistic approach, more of a Neoplatonic or Platonic approach, which again, Gnosticism is a syncretic school of all these different things. So is it monistic or is it dualistic? Well, depends on which school we're talking about, you see. Is it ascetic or is it hedonistic? Well, for the vast majority of Gnostic sects, because the world is evil in their worldview, again, they reject when God created the world and said the world is good. They reject that. They have a totally different interpretation of creation. So because of that, you have to then become ascetic and renounce the physical world. This is the beginning point of your spiritual knowledge. Whereas other groups, such as the Carpocratians, instances of the Simonians, the Gnostic group developed by Simon Magus, the Borborites, we see homosexual tendencies, we see orgiastic sexual rituals, we see inebriating substances. So that sounds very different than the ascetic groups. Well, it is. Because for some of these other Gnostic groups, the way that you break out from the material prison of creation is that you transgress all the boundaries. You transgress. So the idea that you would live ascetic life or not do X, Y, Z, they say, well, that's another illusion. Remember, their epistemic principle or premise about the world, that itself is an illusion. The only thing you can do is acquire more spiritual knowledge, which means have more spiritual experiences. And by that, have gay sex, which we have documented instances of, have various drug-induced experiences, perform magic rituals. This is then going to give you more spiritual knowledge and elevate you. So some of the traditions we're going to talk about took that approach. So ascetic or hedonistic, well, depends on which school you're talking about. All believe, as I said, in the salvific power of knowledge, spiritual knowledge. And Sophia, this sort of the feminine divine wisdom principle, throughout many of these schools can be generally described using Jungian terminology as the anima mundi. So the sort of world soul, if you will. Okay, so Sophia, and that's where people like Bulgakov, an Orthodox theologian, got in trouble because he brought Sophia sort of back into try to incorporate that into Orthodox theology, if you will. We don't need to go into that, but certainly brought about accusations of Gnostic elements into Christianity. So To recap here, epistemologically, the material world is ultimately not real, and therefore it causes questions about making material claims about the world. Therefore, the only thing that you should pursue is spiritual knowledge. So that's their epistemology. The cosmology is that the cosmos and the material world itself is ontologically evil because it's created by Yaldabaoth. And therefore, salvation is acquired through esoteric knowledge, the privileging of secret knowledge. Not everybody gets to know it, right? This is, again, one of the paradigmatic differences between orthodoxy, because theosis in the orthodox sense is the engagement of these uncreated energies: truth, logic, reason, love, mercy, compassion, honor, glory, beauty. Anybody can engage in these things, whether you're deaf or mute, doesn't matter. That you can engage in these practices. Illiterate, doesn't matter. Therefore, theosis allows for a participatory experience in God that Gnosticism and a rationalistic process like Neoplatonism or Scholasticism has a little bit of a tougher time dealing with, because it privileges this sort of intellectual understanding of secret knowledge. Okay. And then the anthropology is, because the material world is bad, your body is bad. Okay. And so therefore, in Gnosticism, the schools that we're going to be going over today, generally speaking, you are a soul and then you have a body, right? We talk about, based on the creation in Genesis, is that we are a body and we have a soul. But because they reject our worldview of creation, that creation is ultimately good, therefore, they instead claim that you're a soul and your body's bad. And this led to many Gnostic schools actually having an aversion to procreation. And so I had a handful of things I want us to keep in mind, because I want to get into all these different things to, as soon as we can, because we got tons of schools to go through. That there's a few general themes that I think we'll find overlap into today's sort of contemporary Gnostic New Age spirituality that we'll even find in some of these ancient Gnostic groups. So as we go through today, keep these in mind. General themes: aversions to procreation. So there's multiple examples that we know of Gnostic groups engaging in only anal and oral sex, and also homoerotic sex, both men and women, so that nobody would procreate. So we see already an aversion to having children in not all, but many Gnostic groups. Do we see this element arise in our contemporary world? I would say to some degree, in fact, we do. So an aversion against procreation led many Gnostic groups to practicing sexual acts or sexual rituals that would not lead to procreation. We have instances, for example, with the Borborites, where they would have ritualistic abortions and celebrate that, because what they did was they prevented a soul from getting trapped into this material prison from their worldview. So we do have instances, according to Hippolytus and Irenaeus, that the Borborites, for example, they would have a sort of ritualistic abortions. Do we see this happen in our world today? Interesting. So general theme, an aversion against procreation, which I think we absolutely see in people today. Vegetarianism. So another element we're going to see in many of these ancient Gnostic groups is that it is condemned to eat meat. Now, we're currently in Lent, and so those of us holding the fast know that we are abstaining from meat right now. But the Orthodox Church does not say that meat is bad. We're doing it to actually show that meat is good. God said everything is good. And so we have a celebration, the feast. We eat a lot of meat. Meat is a good thing. The Orthodox Church does not have aversion to eating meat, even though we have fasting periods in which we renounce it or push it away, restrict it. Many of these Gnostic schools actually were totally vegetarian. And so when we talk about, in some of these, I immediately always think of Jim Bob debating some of these vegans. But it's funny, this spiritual idea that you need to only eat plants. You need to only eat fruit. You need to only eat vegetables. This is more spiritually advanced. Well, we find this idea even in these Gnostic schools that we're going to go over today. So aversion against procreation, vegetarianism. Another one, an elevated status of women. So there was vocal opposition to what they called the sort of patriarchy in the day, even in these ancient in the ancient and medieval period. So within a handful of the Gnostic groups that we'll look at, there is even an elevation of women, and women could in fact lead a spiritual worship. Now, obviously, those who are familiar with Orthodoxy, even Catholicism, but the historic apostolic tradition of Christianity, it is fundamentally a patriarchal tradition of men who are priests. Well, we find that some of these Gnostic groups were vocally in opposition to that. And so when Paul says women should not lead men, or at least lead the church and lead these ritual services, well, what do we find? We find that Gnostic groups, in fact, did this. So is this an early representation of feminism, can you say? I don't know. But again, here's the first three general principles: an aversion against procreation, vegetarianism, and an elevated status of women. The next one is transgressive sexual. As I said, some of these groups were openly only performed anal sex. This is both for men with women, men with men, and then obviously wouldn't be anal sex, but women with women were a thing because, again, the opposition to procreation. So that's another. Do we see that today? Do we see the promotion of sterile forms of sexuality, which was absolutely part of Gnostic spirituality? I would say yes, we do. So I said, including homoeroticism. Homoeroticism was actually elevated for some groups as a higher form of sexuality. We see this with Aleister Crowley, for example, in Thelema. Crowley was very in favor of men being sodomized by other men to be activated spiritually for higher knowledge, if you will. Okay, so I would say this is something that continues on, and we have evidence of this according, again, to Irenaeus and Hippolytus. I think even Tertullian speaks about some of the homosexual acts that the Gnostics were engaging in. And then the last one was inebriating substances. So again, according to all, Tertullian, Hippolytus, and Irenaeus, we know, for example, that certain groups were engaging in inebriating substances. They would get drunk. They would, again, sort of a continuation of the Bacchanalia festivals of Rome, of the pagan festivals. Gnosticism viewed itself, and that's where some of the church fathers highlighted, as the continuation of the mystery schools. And so those of you who are familiar with like the Eleusinian mysteries would know that Albert Hoffman, Karl Ruck, and R. Gordon Watson, they all believed that the Eleusinian mysteries were in fact an inebriating ritual of an ergot derivative. So something similar to LSD or ergot, something like that. And so I actually did a paper tracing drug use up into Aleister Crowley, which I was thinking about making public over on the website. But in it, I actually document specifically some of these instances that I'm talking about, and connect Manichaeanism, which was noted for using their love of mushrooms. And so we have documentation even all the way in China, where they would talk about how the Manichaeans love to eat red and white mushrooms. Could that be the Amanita muscaria? Well, certainly some scholars that are pro psychedelics believe so. But we know for a fact that there were Gnostic groups that were using mushrooms that would believe that they were continuing the inebriating rituals of the Eleusinian mysteries and these mystery schools, generally speaking. And so that's going to come back. Again, I have a whole stream on Soma among the Armenians. Soma, again, the inebriating beverage or god within the Rig Veda. So the Vedic form of Hinduism. But if you want to hear more about that, check over at that. So guys, smash that like if you're here.